that time when I really didn't want to and I didn't have the courage to say no, God helped me. So I was tempted in so many ways, but it was a battle, it was a battle, it was a battle. And what I want to say to all of you people is, if you fight the battle, you'll find one day you've overcome.
Yeah.
You know, it's the fact is that the fact that you're tempted doesn't mean anything serious. And even the fact that you fall, if you hate it and you fight it, and that's what's really helped me. And you know, it doesn't interest me. The time comes when it may take longer with some people and less time with some people, but I want to encourage you to keep fighting that battle. That's the main thing.
Sorry. When you were in Navy, were you thinking of remaining single, or were you any time interested in any girls? Or?
Well, you know, when I was about 23 years old, I was a normal human being attracted to girls probably from the time I was 13 or 12, I don't know, just like anybody else. But I didn't have the boldness to approach any girl, you know, so that's what I think protected me. Indian culture was much more rigid and stiff 50 years ago than it is today. And the thing is, because I became a Christian, when I was 23 years old, I read a verse in the Bible, the book of Jeremiah, and I marked it in my Bible, and where the Lord said, Jeremiah, that you must not take a wife in this place. And I wrote that down, and I felt God had spoken to me, and I was convinced on the basis of that verse, when I was about 23 years old, that I was going to be single for the rest of my life. I was absolutely convinced of it because I wanted to obey God. I felt that's what God told me to do, and I obeyed Him. And so from that day onwards, by God's grace, I never looked at a girl and considered her as a prospective marriage partner. Every proposal that came to me, I'd say, sorry, I'm not getting married.
So what do you
and that protected me for that period, because I see that God allowed me to think like that because He wanted me to study the scriptures instead of just going around looking at, find out, is this my partner, is that my partner.
Then how did you get interest in marriage later?
Yeah. Well, when I left the Navy, I was 26 and a half years old when I left the Navy.
Incidentally, what made you leave the Navy, brother?
Okay. When I was 24 and a half, I used to travel around with Br.Zac during my holiday time. We used to get 60 days leave every year. And I used to travel around with Br.Zac to different places, preach in different places, and I found tremendous liberty in preaching. I found I had a real gift in preaching when I was 23 years old. Even Br.Zac recognized it. And I was the youngest person he ever invited to speak in his convocation. And that message, by the way, is on the website, A New Vessel Full of Salt, which I preached when 63, which is 40 years ago. I found I had a gift, and I found this tremendous need everywhere. And I felt, boy, it looks as if I can do more good going around preaching than, since God's given me a gift, than being in the Navy. So as that burden grew, one day when I was reading the scriptures in Isaiah 49, that was my daily portion, sitting in a train coming from KGF with Br.Zac to Bangalore, interestingly. We stopped at Bangarapet to change trains, and by the time God had already spoken to me in that short journey from Isaiah 49, it was a clear call for me from that, which I'd been thinking of before, that I must leave. And while I was sitting in Bangarapet station, thinking about this, Br.Zac, who's known me for a number of years, came up to me and asked me, we were all waiting to catch the train, when are you thinking of leaving the Navy? I said, this man's a prophet. He knows what I'm thinking about. God had spoken to him to confirm to me what I had already been thinking. I said, brother, I just decided to leave. And so we came here to Bangalore to the house of worship, Herman, and I got up there and I said, I've decided to leave the Navy. I went back to Cochin and I put in my resignation. Just when I went back, I got an order from Naval Headquarters that I had been selected for the most prestigious course that any officer of my rank could get. It was just like the devil offering me all the kingdoms of the world at that very moment. And I put in my resignation, and my senior officer said, "You're a fool. There are other people who try so hard for this course and don't get it. You got it so easily. Are you sure? Go back and think about it." I said, "Sir, I've decided. I'm not interested in this."
So you thought of marriage after leaving Navy?
Yeah,
is
after
it?
leaving, but they didn't release me for 2 years.
Yeah.
I kept saying, because I said to Naval Headquarters, Jesus Christ has called me for his work. They said, "We couldn't care less for that. You got to work here." Because they had spent so many lakhs training me. And so when I began to travel around, I found it was very dangerous. Because, you stand up in the pulpit and so many girls are eyeing you, and so many mothers of girls are eyeing you.
But you already got the verse that you had to be single, no?
Sorry?
You already got the verse that you had to be single.
Yeah. But I said, "Lord, I don't find, what am I going to do? I mean, in a moment of weakness, I may suddenly say yes to somebody." I got really scared as I was traveling around, and I went back to that verse, and the Lord, it says there, "You shall not marry in this place." Then I realized it was as long as I was in the Navy that I was not to get married. It became clear to me. Otherwise, I had a struggle with that verse, but the Lord hid that part from me all the years I was in the Navy. And then when I left, of course, I had no job, no salary. I decided I would never consider marriage as long as I was in the Navy. So I knew that if somebody married me, and I was bald and I had everything against me. So if somebody married me, it must only be for spiritual reasons. So that's how it.
So how did you decide to marry Sister Annie?
Yeah, well, you see, our Indian culture is such that you can't take people out for a date or anything like that. But it's very interesting that when I was in the Navy, when I was about 24 years old, I was invited to speak at a retreat for students. I used to minister among students, young people, when I was in the Navy. And there was the chairman of Clarence School here was a man called Alva. He was a lieutenant those days. We were good friends because we used to have meetings together. He was in the same assembly. And his father-in-law came to Cochin and heard me preach. And his father-in-law was a professor in CMC Vellore. And so when he heard me preach, he went back to CMC Vellore and told the students, "You got to get this man from the Navy to come here and speak." And the secretary of that students' union was a young sister called Annie Uman. And and she said, "We don't want any naval people here. We want some serious Christians." And so he said, "No, you call him." So she wrote a letter to me. "Dear brother in Christ, we would like to invite you." I didn't know who she was, and she didn't know who I was.
But did she attend any of your meetings before?
I'm amazed at God from heaven watching all this with a twinkle in his eye. Because he knew the future and I didn't know. And I replied, "Okay, dear sister, thank you very much for your invitation." And I didn't know who she was, just a name to me. And I went there and I preached. And boy, it was real revival. They never had, the hall got so filled, they had to change the hall to another place. And then we had meetings in the hospital, CMC hospital, the place was packed out. And that's where I first saw her. But of course, I was not getting married, so the question didn't arise.
But did you get time to talk to her?
Maybe praise the Lord, sister.
No, when you saw her, were you attracted to her?
Okay, the question is, when I saw her, was I attracted to her?
We must ask her whether she was attracted. Tell us.
This is hard talk.
This is something very interesting.
Now this is real hard talk. Now we have both of them up here now. No, you can answer that, Br.Zac, again. Were you attracted?
Yeah, no, he's asked her whether she was attracted to
Okay.
me.
No doubt about that.
Well, I had a struggle with it because I had disciplined myself not to be attracted. So, I used to preach in a peculiar way those days. I would turn to the brothers and I would sound like this. I said, I don't want to be tempted. I'm a young man and I've got to preach. I would stand like this every time I preached. And I would be very formal and very stiff and everything else. But then, after that, when I began to consider marriage, I thought about her. I said, well, she's a doctor. She's not going to marry some jobless guy like me. And I don't know where she is. And then, Brother Br.Zac one day called me and said, I've got somebody in mind for you. And he said, Annie, because she used to go to that assembly. And there was a brother called Chandapilla who was in charge of the students. He was the first general secretary of UESI. He called me one day and said, Brother Zac, I've got somebody in mind for you. And that's Annie. Two people said the same thing. And then I of course, I had no problem accepting it because I was attracted. But I still wanted to be sure of God's will. And I said, Lord, I don't know whether, is she wholehearted? Is she willing to pay the price of a difficult life? And so when we did meet, I told her, listen, I don't know where I'm going to live. I may live in a hut. I may go to Rajasthan. I don't know what my ministry is. I've just left the Navy 2 years ago, or a year ago. It was just 1 year after I left. I don't know what I'm going to do. I have no money. And I painted the bleakest, darkest picture I could ever paint of the future. And I said, don't give me an answer. Think about it for 3 days. I didn't say 3 years, 3 days. And of course, I hoped that her answer would be yes. But I inquired from other people, and somebody told me that all her colleagues were going to America and she was going to work in a leprosy hospital. And I said, well, that's a good sign. And then somebody else told me that even though she was a doctor, she was sleeping on the floor in the general ward to help some poor sister who was admitted. I said, well, that's the type of person I want.
But were you drawn to her because she was a doctor, or was it
no.
any other factors, brother?
I couldn't care less whether she was a doctor. If she was a sweeper, that would be fine too. I never cared for being Malayali. I never cared for being
What are the qualities you're looking for? What are the qualities you're looking for?
I wanted someone who was sold out for God. I wanted someone who was willing to suffer anything for Jesus Christ. I wanted someone who cared for the poor and who cared, because most of India is poor people, and who was willing to serve at any cost to themselves.
But these days, brother, many want good-looking girls and educated girls and also spiritual. What do you do?
I wasn't good looking, so how could I ask for good looking?
No, I think we must ask Sister Annie then. What was it that drew you to Br.Zac, and were you attracted to him? Was it love at first sight? What was it?
Since it's a press conference, I think I have to be very careful in what I say. But definitely I had a lot of admiration for him. When I heard him speak...
was it because he's good looking, sister?
Yeah.
Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah. I found him handsome.
Still handsome.
One more mic you can give.
But when I heard him speak at the retreat, I felt that God was speaking to me, telling me that I should remain single and I should go to the leprosy hospital and not think of marriage. That's how his message is. Yeah,
you wanted to be single too.
I felt like God wanted me to think of him first of all. But
Him means him.
Oh God. But when I was just before going to the leprosy hospital, Brother Br.Zac called me to Madras and he spoke to me to consider Zac and pray about it. That's how I started.
So how long did it take for you to know that Zac was the right one for you?
because Brother Br.Zac had suggested, I was more or less inclined, and I had also heard my husband speak. So, heard him speak, and so I knew that I would like to marry a person. I mean, he's my hero, so I would like to marry Zac. But I had to.
Zac, how long did it take you to know that Annie was the right person?
But I was praying about it because I didn't know whether he would, I didn't know that Brother Br.Zac had already talked to Zac about me. So then I was just waiting for God to show me whether my husband was interested in me or like that. And when I was praying, I got some guidance that I should now consider marriage, and but I had already committed that I was going to the leprosy hospital, so I was working there and praying about it.
But how much did you know about this, sister?
Zac came to the leprosy in Karigiri. There's a small training center. He came there and took some meetings, and that's the time we talked very briefly about it, and he asked me to pray about it. And by then Brother Br.Zac had already hinted about it. So he told me to pray about it for 3 days and reply. So I prayed about it, and I replied to him what my answer was, but he didn't get my reply.
Oh, yeah. The letter never came.
That letter didn't reach him.
And I was in a panic.
Were you in love already, brother?
I was wondering what happened. Waiting for the postman every day. No letter, no letter, no letter, no letter. It's the sovereignty of God, you know. It's like God saying, who is more important in your life? Finally it became so bad, I called her up. I said, I told you to write after 3 days. Even if it's no. She said, I wrote after 3 days. I said, yes. Oh. Yeah, I must say I fell in love.
Good.
Not fall, I rose up in love, not fell in love.
But did you want to get to know her, brother, earlier?
No, I didn't I just knew that she really loved the Lord. And she had an interest in the books I was interested in about the way of the cross and things like that. The biographies I read of people like Jim Elliot and things like that, those are the type of stuff she was reading too. So we knew we had like-minded, and our parents never knew about this. This was entirely between Br.Zac and her and me. And after that, I told my parents and she told her parents. And it was, my parents said okay, but her parents said, no, we'll never let you marry this man. We didn't train you up to be a doctor to get some fellow who doesn't have a job. I don't blame them. I think if some daughter of mine far away said she's marrying some full-time worker, I would have some questions in my mind too. But then he finally agreed.
Yeah.
Within 3 months.
Yeah, while we're on this subject, I think everybody's awake now. What would you say to young brothers and sisters attracted to one another? What would you say about a young brother and sister, if I may use the term, falling in love with each other? And if they do, what is your advice? How should they conduct themselves?
See, I personally don't believe there's anything wrong in falling in love, because I think we did both fall in love with each other. But the basis on which we loved each other was not physical. You see, it's true that I'll tell you absolutely honestly that I found her very attractive physically, and I still do, because beauty is not determined by these Miss Universe contests. Beauty is more than physical. It's a total thing. And as I see it, it was the spiritual part which is primary but not the only. I felt that it's perfectly right if you are drawn to a person because of spiritual values first, not just because you want to get married. Because some people, just because they want to get married, get attracted to somebody and they're very unhappy. Within 6 months they wish they hadn't got married. I've been married 35 years. I'll tell you the honest truth before God. I have seen numerous girls in many parts of the world. I've never felt that I could ever have married any one of them. I mean, my honest conviction is that if I hadn't married Annie, I'd probably have been single for the rest of my life, because I just didn't find anybody. So it was not a question of okay, this is the only one available, I better get married. It wasn't like that for me. For some people it may be, I don't say it's wrong, but for me it wasn't like that. I pray that whoever gets married, they'll be drawn to someone through spiritual factors. And it may be, you see, ours is, in a sense, we didn't go dating for so many days and then discover each other. We sought God. And I say God is not the prisoner of any culture. He's not bound to Western culture. Or in the West they do it one way, in the East they do it the other way. God is the one who leads the people who date, and God's the one in India who leads the people who know, God knows in their culture they cannot date. So what? But God is not the prisoner of a particular culture. And whichever way we do it, God must lead us. And then we'll have a very happy marriage.
How long did you have to wait? Did you all have to wait till you got married? After
Yeah,
you knew?
well, because her parents objected, it was about 10 months after we ourselves decided that we would accept each other, a little over 10 months that we actually got married.
So, what would you say, I mean, in that time, how much did you know of each other?
Well, by correspondence, and she was living in the middle of Maharashtra and I was traveling here and there, and we could write letters. But when her father said no, then no correspondence. He said, then we respect, I believe that we must honor our parents. I said, your father is a believer, we must honor him, we will do what he says. If he says no, we commit it to the Lord. And I didn't write. And then when her father finally came home and agreed to it, to my home, that is, to my parents' home, agreed to it, then we could correspond more freely.
Sister, you're not looking for a doctor to be married to, is it?
I just wanted God's will in my life. Even when I was a medical student, I spent most of my free time with the Evangelical Union and visiting the hospital and arranging meetings for fellow students. So I was interested a lot in serving the Lord. So I was not primarily interested in a doctor. But sometimes I used to think that my classmates who married doctors, they did well in their profession because both were doing the same thing. But in my case, my goal was not my profession. So that was okay with me.
I suppose you don't have any regrets that you didn't marry a doctor?
No, I have no regrets about that.
Now, in this time while you have waited for one another, I mean, did you daydream and fantasize?
Oh, sure.
In a good way?
Plenty.
Yeah.
Br.Zac, you have mentioned on several occasions that many young people backslide after marriage. Did you backslide after marriage, or how did you overcome this problem?
I think I was at the other extreme. I was traveling, ministering, and I continued traveling and ministering, and sometimes left my wife for long periods. I would not recommend that today. I didn't have wisdom. I really sought to serve the Lord. I thought serving the Lord meant that I got to, whether I'm married or not, if I have to go away for 3 weeks. I think within 2 months of my marriage, I left my wife and went off to Sri Lanka for quite some time for some meetings, and I continued traveling continuously, even my first year of marriage. But I wouldn't recommend that right now. I think I was a bit foolish. I should have spent more time with my wife. But my understanding, I sought to love the Lord, and I think one thing that helped me was we were very poor, and it's easier for rich people to backslide than poor people to backslide. When a poor person is poor and serving the Lord, we have to cling to the Lord. We don't even have money to survive. I had no income, and all the money she earned, she had to work for 1 year in our marriage because she had a bond to the hospital, but that entire money which she worked for 1 year, she sent to her parents because she had other brothers and sister who were still studying. So she sent all of her first year's salary, that's the only year she ever worked in her life, sent to her parents. So we were very poor, and I think that kept us close to the Lord. That's what I can think.
While you're on that subject, yeah. See, you came from a family where, maybe a wealthy middle class family, would say.
Middle class, I would say, but not wealthy.
Okay.
We were average. My father was not a rich man. He was in the government service and just earned what. He was a very honest person. Never made any money more than any government servant would make.
How did you all accommodate yourselves to a simple lifestyle after you got married?
I think both of us had decided that we were going to serve the Lord. And even when I was in the Navy, I used to discipline myself by sleeping on the floor. I think I can still sleep on the floor today. I would sometimes go 2 days without food while I was on the ship, just drink some liquids to prepare myself to serve the Lord, and try to kneel down and pray for a whole night, and things which maybe they were just physical feats, but I wanted to discipline myself, and I knew that if I serve the Lord, I have to live a very simple life. So, and I'd given up all my money to God's work. I didn't have any savings left when I left the Navy. So we just accepted that. We knew that Jesus was poor, the apostles were poor, so we were in good company. We just accepted it.
I had asked you a question earlier. Maybe you can give your opinion, both you and Sister Annie. What is your opinion about young people falling in love? Now we are in a country of mixed cultures. Now in some cultures, in some places, people would like to have an arranged marriage. What is your opinion of, young people falling in love with each other? And what is your opinion on that? And then I'll ask you the next question.
I don't think there's anything wrong with it if the attraction is purely based on something spiritual, but I would say that as soon as possible thereafter, you should tell your parents about it in India. Because if you're considering marriage, I personally believe that we should get the blessing of parents if parents are born again believers. And since her father was a born again believer, I knew that. I've never met him, he never met me. I told her that we will honor your parents, and until he says yes, I won't marry you. If it means I have to wait, I'll wait. I'll wait 20 years, 30 years. Because I have faith in God that if it is God's will, He'll speak to your father. And in 3 months, God spoke to her father. And he agreed, without even seeing me. It's really amazing how he agreed without even seeing my face.
He didn't want to see you, brother.
No.
He didn't want to see you.
No, he was naturally scared. Whenever anybody gives a daughter in marriage, the first thing they think of is, will this man be able to take care of my daughter? And secondly, is he trying to exploit her medical profession to make her work and earn money because he's, people going to full-time work. You talk about in India today a full-time worker. 90% of them are crooks. So naturally, full-time worker has got a bad impression. So how does he know whether I'm in that 90% or the other 10%? I don't blame him one bit. But then, so he said, he ruled it out. But then he used to, in his business, he used to travel all over India, and he met some missionaries whom he had a tremendous respect for. And he asked their opinion. And he asked someone whether, there's some guy called Br.Zac who wants to marry my daughter. That chap said, boy, you'll be lucky if you get him, or something like that. So God made him meet the right people. And so he got some good reports from these people. And when he heard those reports, I think he was also a believer who feared God. Otherwise, a person who was only interested in money would never allow that. He agreed to it, and he told her that, okay.
Sister Annie, what's your advice to young people who fall in love with each other? And the second part of that question is, if you agree with that, how should they conduct themselves till they get married?
If a girl is a believer, definitely if she falls in love with an unbeliever, we should say immediately rule it out, because we should not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. So there's no question of falling in love with unbelievers. But if you are interested and like a believer and pray about it, definitely we should tell our parents and wait for their consent, and we should not do things on the sly and put ourselves in embarrassing situations. But
how would you know a person is a believer? How would you know that somebody is a believer?
His testimony, he has accepted the Lord and he loves the Lord, and his values, when you talk to him, you know what his values are, and like that we can know.
Brother, these days people don't think of finding God's will. They say, must get to know one another before we get married. What do you say for that?
I believe you can't marry somebody you don't know anything about.
Yeah.
I could not have married her if somebody just said, any woman. How can I find out who's any woman? I don't know. So you need to know something. The thing is, in the Western countries, they try to find out in one way, and here in this country, we find out another way. That's the only difference. But in both cases, we need some information on the basis of which we decide. And it's a question of how we get that information. In the Western countries, they tend to sort of go out together and try to know each other. Or here, because we can't do that and keep our testimony, at least couldn't do it in my days, things may be different now. We had to depend on God more and say, Lord, give me correct information. And I believe God loves us so much that He will give us the right information about a person within the limitations of our culture, and find out from people who know about the other person, and not blindly go ahead. I don't believe that I would ever have fallen in love with anybody if I didn't feel that that person was a totally committed Christian. And I want to say now, looking back after 35 years of marriage, marriage, there are so many pressures, and particularly when you have children. And if you men marry a girl who is not a wholehearted Christian, when some pressure comes, they don't know how to handle it. You'll have to be the one whom they lean on all the time for any spiritual problem. So where the answer is only found in God, they don't know God so well. And you have to be everything. Well, I thank God I didn't have to be everything, because she knew God as well as me. She could pray as much as me. If I'm not there, she doesn't have to ask me. She can ask God. Whereas if you marry someone who doesn't know the Lord, who just was born again yesterday or something like that, what's going to happen when your children have a problem later on in life? And you hear somebody who doesn't know the Lord, and she lean on you as a crutch. It'll be like marrying a lame person whom you have to carry around all the time, who can't stand on her own feet. Maybe alive, born again, but lame. You wouldn't marry a physically lame person because it would be a tremendous handicap. You should not marry a spiritually lame person, even if the person is born again. That's why you need to really ask God to show you as much as possible, within the limitations of Indian culture, whether this person can really be strong on his own. And if you girls are getting married, the thing that will help you the most is if you can say, can I look up to this person? Can this person is someone whom I can really look up to all my life, not whom I have to accept as my head because the Bible says the husband is the head of the wife, but whom spontaneously I can look up to because he's my leader.
Brother, do you think the young people should consult anyone, or they can just make decisions on their own?
See, love is sometimes at first sight. You have to admit that.
I was blind, you see.
It's blind also, but they say, but it shouldn't be blind. In fact, the saying is, keep both eyes open before you get married and one eye shut after you get married, so that you don't see all the faults in your husband or wife. The time to keep one eye shut is after marriage. Before marriage, keep both eyes wide open. So, but the thing is, when you see somebody who you find is really spiritually minded, if you're a spiritually minded girl or boy, you're naturally attracted to that person. And in your mind, you begin to consider, boy, that'll be good if I can marry that person. There's nothing wrong with that feeling. But you have to consider the possibilities of it and say, are you compatible to one another in socially, economically, educationally, like that, in the sense that, can you speak the same language? Can you speak at the same level? There are so many factors like this you got to think of. And then I would say the next step is, in our culture anyway, if you've got God-fearing parents, tell your parents about it. Or if you don't have God-fearing parents, go and tell an elder in whom you have confidence. If you don't have confidence in your local church elder, find some other elder brother in somewhere else, or some godly person, need not be from your church, who will keep your confidence and advise you and who can help you. I would say definitely we must consult. In the multitude of counselors, there is safety.
What about some practical advice to young people who are interested in one another and they have to wait till they get married? What should they do?
I think first of all they should decide whether they are definitely deciding to get married. Otherwise they shouldn't continue a friendship too long, because very often things break up, and I would say consider all the factors before you decide to commit yourself to each other. Especially in India, you need to consider the opinion of parents. Whether you like it or not, in Indian culture, marriage is marriage into a family. Unlike Western culture, where you marry an individual, full stop. In Indian culture, you're marrying into a family. There are very close links with the family. You cannot avoid it. And therefore, you need to consider whether the girl's parents or the boy's parents will accept this. Are you sure of that? If not, pull the reins back a bit, hold on, and wait till. That's what I did. I mean, when parents didn't agree, I say, okay, we'll wait. And that's a place where you're tested whether God is first or the other person is first in your. And I even said to the Lord, if you don't want to marry her, that's fine. Your will is more important to me than anything else, and you are more important to me. I'm not going to be disappointed. I mean, I'll feel sad, but disappointment is only if God gives up on me, which will never happen.
Sister Annie, would you like to say something on that? Give some advice. Give us your opinion.
Yeah. I agree that we must wait for our parents to. God's blessing is there if we honor our parents, and even if unbelieving parents, I think if we have faith, I don't know, I feel that they can at least, but I am convinced that we shouldn't run away and get married.
Yeah.
Definitely that's wrong. We should wait for both parents to be happy about it.
Thank you.
Well, our time is running out, and brother, in closing, can you tell us what's the secret of your Christian life?